In the middle of a violent snowstorm, a billionaire finds a freezing little girl curled beside his trash gate. Her lips tremble as she whispers, "Please, I don't want to die outside." What he discovers about the woman chasing her will force him to risk everything to protect her. The wind came screaming down the Blackridge Mountains that night, like it wanted to rip the world apart. Snow slammed against the towering glass windows of Callan Voss's estate, whitening the pines, swallowing the stone driveway, blurring the world into something ghostly and cruel. Outside, winter was merciless. Inside, everything was polished perfection, soft amber light, a fire burning low in the massive stone hearth, jazz drifting lazily through rooms too large for one man to fill. The house was beautiful, expensive, flawless, and completely empty. Callan stood near the window in a charcoal sweater, one hand wrapped around a glass of bourbon he had barely touched. At 37, he had become the kind of man the world admired from a distance, disciplined, powerful, untouchable. He controlled markets, people, outcomes. He trusted systems, schedules, locked gates, and the illusion that if a man arranged his life carefully enough, chaos would never find him again. But Ash knew better. The golden retriever stood rigid near the front door, ears pinned, a low whine trembling in his throat. Callan barely glanced over. "It's a storm, not a crisis." Ash barked once. Sharp, urgent. The sound cut through the quiet. With visible irritation, Callan crossed the foyer and unlocked the front door. A blade of freezing wind tore into the house the second it opened. Ash bolted into the white darkness. "Unbelievable," Callan muttered, pulling his coat tighter as he stepped outside. Snow crunched under his boots as he followed the dog toward the rear service gate where the black trash bins sat half buried under drifting snow. Ash had stopped there, completely still, staring. At first, Callan thought it was a pile of discarded fabric caught against the bins. Then it moved. Small, curled, human. His heart slammed once hard, and suddenly the storm was no longer the most dangerous thing outside. Callan ran. The snow fought him every step of the way, grabbing at his boots, whipping his face, turning the short distance to the rear gate into something brutal and unreal. Ash stayed planted beside the shape in the snow, tense and silent now, as if even the dog understood that one wrong movement might shatter whatever fragile thing was left there. When Callan dropped to his knees, the world seemed to narrow into one impossible sight. A little girl, no older than 8. She was curled on her side beside the trash bins, wearing a thin yellow cardigan over a faded spring dress, the kind meant for sunshine and school pictures, not a Colorado blizzard. Her bare legs were mottled purple from the cold. Snow clung to her lashes, her hair, her small, trembling shoulders. One shoe was missing. The other hung half off her foot, soaked through. Her arms were wrapped around herself as if she had been trying with the last of her strength to make her body smaller than the storm. "Hey," Callan said, but his voice broke on the word. Her eyes opened slowly. Gray-blue, unfocused, dazed. For a second she looked at him as if she wasn't sure whether he was a man or a hallucination sent by the cold. Then her cracked lips parted. Her teeth chattered so violently he almost couldn't make out the words. "Mister," she whispered. Callan leaned closer, snow soaking through his trousers, freezing against his skin. He didn't care. The child swallowed painfully, as though each breath scraped her raw from the inside. Then she said in a voice so small it nearly disappeared into the wind, "Please, I don't want to die outside." Everything inside him tore open, not pity, not shock. Something deeper, older, more violent. A grief he had spent years burying rose straight into his throat. "No," he said instantly, fiercely, as if speaking against death itself. "No, not tonight." And in that moment, Callan Voss stopped being a man merely watching a storm. He became the one person standing between that child and the cold. Callan shrugged off his coat without thinking and wrapped it around the girl's shaking shoulders. The fabric swallowed her completely. When he slid his arms beneath her to lift her, she flinched so violently it startled him. Not from the cold, something deeper than that. Something trained into her bones. "Easy," he murmured quickly. "You're okay? I've got you." She weighed almost nothing. That frightened him more than the storm. Ash trotted beside them as Callan carried her across the yard, the wind howling behind them, like something angry they had stolen prey from. By the time he reached the front door, the girl's fingers had weakly tangled into the collar of his sweater, clinging as if she were afraid he might vanish. Inside, warmth rushed to meet them. The door slammed shut against the storm, sealing the house again in quiet luxury, firelight, polished floors, towering ceilings. The same beautiful emptiness that had greeted him every night for years. But tonight, it felt different. Alive. He carried her straight to the long couch near the fireplace and laid her down carefully. Blankets, he needed blankets. He grabbed one from the chair, another from the hallway closet, another from the guest room upstairs. When he returned, she was still gripping the edge of his coat, like letting go would send her back into the snow. "You're safe," he said softly. The words sounded strange in this house. Safe. He crouched beside her and noticed the bruises for the first time. Dark fingerprints along her upper arm, a fading cut near her collarbone, a yellowing mark near her wrist. This was no child who had simply gotten lost. This was a child who had run. Her eyes darted toward the front door, suddenly panic flashing across her pale face. "She can't come here," the girl whispered urgently. Callan felt his chest tighten. "Who can't?" Her voice trembled. "The bad lady." For the first time that night, the storm outside no longer felt like the real danger. Callan moved carefully, like a man handling something fragile enough to shatter with the wrong breath. He knelt beside the couch, while the fire cracked quietly behind them, its orange light dancing across the blankets wrapped around the small, trembling girl. Ash had planted himself at her feet, chin resting on her ankle, as if guarding her was the most natural job in the world. "You're warm now," Callan said gently. "You're safe here." The girl didn't relax. Her eyes kept flicking toward the front door, every creak of the house making her shoulders tighten. When a branch scraped across the glass window from the wind outside, she flinched so hard the blankets slipped from her shoulders. Callan reached forward slowly and pulled them back around her. "No one's coming through that door," he said quietly. "Not without me knowing." She stared at him, studying his face with a seriousness far too old for a child. "Promise," she whispered. "Yes." The word came out before he could even think. For a moment the fear in her expression softened only a little, but enough that she stopped gripping the blanket quite so tightly. "Can you tell me your name?" he asked. She hesitated. Then very softly, "Maisie." "That's a beautiful name," he said. "I'm Callan." Maisie looked down at her hands, rubbing them together slowly, as if trying to bring life back into her frozen fingers. That was when Callan noticed something written along the side of her palm. Blue ink. Numbers. Smudged, shaky, pressed so hard into the skin it had nearly torn the paper-thin surface of her hand. A phone number. Callan leaned closer. "Who wrote that?" Maisie's lips trembled before she answered. "My mom." Why her voice dropped to a whisper. "She said if I got away, I should show it to someone kind." The room went very still. Outside, the storm howled against the house like a warning. And suddenly Callan understood something with chilling clarity. This little girl hadn't wandered into the snow. She had escaped into it. Callan stared at the numbers written across Maisie's palm. The ink had smeared where melting snow had touched her skin, but most of it was still readable. Whoever had written it had pressed hard enough that the faint outline of the digits was nearly carved into her hand. Someone had been desperate for her to remember. "Maisie," he said carefully, "do you know whose number this is to Mom's?" She answered immediately. Her voice was small but certain. Callan nodded slowly. And where is your mom now? Maisie's shoulders drew in a little like a door quietly closing. I don't know, she whispered. They took me away. A heavy silence settled over the room. Who took you? Maisie hesitated again, glancing toward the door, as if even speaking about it might summon someone. Her fingers twisted into the edge of the blanket. The lady, she murmured. What lady? Maisie swallowed. The one in heels. Callan felt a cold weight settle in his chest. She smiles when people are watching, Maisie continued quietly. But when the doors close, she says kids like me should be grateful. Ash lifted his head slightly at the tension in the room, ears twitching. Callan leaned forward a little. Did she hurt you? Maisie didn't answer directly. Instead, she looked down at the bruises along her arms, tracing one of them lightly with her fingertip. She says I make things difficult, she whispered. The words hit harder than if she had screamed. Because children who are told they are difficult often learn to disappear. Callan forced his voice to stay calm. What's her name? Maisie looked up at him slowly. Her eyes held that same deep, exhausted fear he had seen outside in the snow. Then she said the name that would unravel everything. Vivian. Callan stood slowly, the name echoing in his mind. Vivian. Maisie watched him carefully, as if trying to read whether saying it had been a mistake. You're not in trouble, he said gently. You did the right thing. She nodded faintly, but the fear in her eyes didn't disappear. Callan stepped into the kitchen, his phone already in his hand. The house felt different now, less like a quiet shelter, and more like the center of something dangerous that had just begun to unfold. He dialed. Mara answered on the second ring. Callan, it's midnight, she said groggily. I need you, he replied, voice low and steady. Right now. The tone alone woke her fully. What happened? It's a child. 8, maybe. Hypothermia. Bruises. He paused. And she's terrified someone named Vivian is coming for her. There was silence for 1 second. Then Mara said, I'm on my way. Callan hung up and leaned against the counter for a moment, staring at the dark window above the sink. Snow was still falling hard, swallowing the world outside the house. The storm had erased nearly every footprint in the yard already, except the one that had led him to her. When he returned to the living room, Maisie hadn't moved. She sat exactly where he had left her, shoulders tight beneath the blankets, eyes flicking to the door every few seconds. Is she coming? Maisie asked quietly. Callan shook his head. No. But she always finds me. The certainty in her voice made his chest tighten. He crouched beside the couch so they were eye level again. Maisie, he said softly. No one walks into this house unless I let them. She searched his face for a long moment. Then very slowly she asked the question that mattered most. You won't send me back? Callan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced at the bruises on her arms, the numbers written in ink on her hand, the fear that had driven her into a blizzard. Then he met her eyes. No, he said quietly. And this time he meant it. Morning arrived quietly. The blizzard had exhausted itself during the night, leaving Blackridge buried under a wide, blinding sheet of white. Sunlight spilled through the tall windows of Callan's house, bright and innocent, as if the world outside had never been violent. But inside the house, the tension had not melted with the snow. Maisie sat at the edge of the dining table, wearing one of Callan's oversized t-shirts that hung nearly to her knees. Her yellow cardigan lay folded carefully beside her, like something important she didn't want to lose. Ash sat pressed against her leg. She ate toast slowly, too slowly for a hungry child. Every bite seemed cautious, like she was afraid the plate might disappear if she moved too quickly. You can have more, Callan said gently from the kitchen. Maisie nodded, but she didn't reach for it. Callan's phone rested on the counter beside him. He had spent the early morning searching records while Mara checked Maisie again before leaving for the hospital. One result had stopped him cold. Name Maisie Wren. Age 8. Status missing from placement. Missing from placement. Not missing from home. Not missing from her mother. Placement. As if she were a package that had been stored somewhere and then misplaced. Callan's jaw tightened. He walked slowly back toward the table and crouched beside her chair. "Musifa," he said softly, "what's your last name?" She hesitated before answering. "Wren." The confirmation settled into the room like something heavy. Callan nodded once. "Does your mom's name happen to be Elena?" Maisie's head snapped up instantly. "How do you know that?" she asked, fear and hope colliding in her voice. Callan didn't answer right away. Because before he could say anything else, the doorbell rang. The sound cut through the house like a blade. Maisie froze. Her eyes widened with pure terror. And in a whisper so quiet it barely existed, she said, "She found me." The doorbell rang again. Sharp, patient, certain. Maisie's chair scraped against the floor as she pushed herself back from the table. Her breathing became shallow, quick, like someone bracing for something she had already survived before. Callan felt the shift instantly. "It's okay," he said calmly, but Maisie shook her head. "No," she whispered. "She always comes when people say it's okay." That sentence stayed with him. Callan moved slowly toward the front door, while Ash followed at his side, the dog's posture alert, now protective. Behind him, Maisie had retreated halfway down the hallway, her small body partially hidden beside the wall, as if instinct had told her that open spaces were dangerous. When Callan opened the door, the cold air of the morning slipped into the foyer. But the woman standing there was not the one Maisie feared. She wore a dark coat, boots dusted with snow, and a simple leather badge clipped near the collar. "Mr. Voss?" she asked calmly. "Yes. Tessa Vale. Child Protective Services." Callan stepped aside. Tessa entered carefully, the way experienced investigators do, observing, without making it obvious. Her eyes passed across the quiet house, the fire still glowing in the living room, the untouched second plate of toast on the table. Then she saw Maisie. The girl had stopped halfway down the hall, frozen in place, her hands clutching the fabric of the oversized shirt she wore. Tessa softened her voice immediately. "Hi there," she said gently. "My name's Tessa." Maisie didn't move. She didn't answer. She only looked past Tessa toward the open door, as if waiting for another figure to appear behind her. Callan noticed. "Maisie," he said quietly. "She's here to help." Maisie's eyes flicked up to his. Then she whispered something so softly that only he could hear it. "They always say that." Tessa did not move closer right away. People who worked around frightened children learned quickly that distance could be the difference between trust and panic. She crouched slightly near the entryway instead, lowering herself so she wasn't towering over the small figure frozen in the hallway. "Maisie," she said gently, "I'm not here to take you anywhere yet. I just need to make sure you're safe." Maisie's eyes shifted to Callan, not to Tessa, to him. It was the look of a child, asking silently whether she should believe what she was hearing. Callan stepped closer, careful with every movement. "Do you want me to stay here while you talk?" Maisie nodded immediately. Tessa noticed that. She noticed everything. "Okay," Tessa said softly. "We can do that." But before the conversation could begin, another sound cut through the house. A car engine. Callan's head turned toward the driveway instinctively. Maisie reacted instantly. She bolted, not toward the door, toward the hallway. Within seconds, she disappeared into the laundry room, the door swinging halfway shut behind her. Ash trotted after her. Callan followed more slowly and found her hiding behind a row of hanging coats, half buried in fabric like a small animal trying to disappear inside a den. Ash stood pressed against her legs, his body forming a quiet barrier between her and the world. Her voice trembled when she spoke. "If they make me go back," she whispered into the dog's fur. Callan crouched in the doorway. "Maisie." She didn't look up. "I won't survive it." The words were not dramatic. They were not shouted. They were simply said like something she already knew to be true. Behind him, Tessa stood very still in the hallway. And in that moment, everyone in the house understood something terrifying. Maisie hadn't run into the storm by accident. She had run because the storm felt safer than where she came from. The sound of the car door outside was sharp in the quiet morning. Callan remained crouched in the laundry room doorway, watching Maisie where she stood hidden among the hanging coats. Ash had planted himself firmly in front of her, his body angled protectively, his ears alert to every sound coming from the driveway. Maisie's fingers twisted in the thick fur at the back of the dog's neck. "She's here," she whispered. Callan felt a slow, steady tension tighten across his chest. "You don't have to come out," he told her gently. "Not unless you want to." Maisie shook her head. "I don't want her to see me first." That sentence carried more history than it should have. From the hallway, Tessa spoke quietly. "Mr. Voss, someone is walking up to the door." Callan rose and moved back toward the foyer. The doorbell rang again. This time it was confident, deliberate. When he opened the door, the woman standing on the porch looked exactly like the kind of person who never expected to be refused entry anywhere. Vivian Crowe was elegant in a way that felt almost rehearsed. A long charcoal coat fell perfectly over narrow shoulders. Dark hair was pinned back neatly. Her boots were spotless despite the snow, and a slim leather folder rested calmly in her gloved hands. Her smile appeared the moment the door opened. "Mr. Voss," she said warmly, "thank you for keeping Maisie safe. She can be impulsive when she's upset." The calmness in her voice made Callan's stomach turn. Behind him, he heard the faint shift of fabric from the hallway. Maisie had stepped just far enough from the laundry room to see the foyer. The moment she saw Vivian, her face went pale. Her small voice trembled. "That's her." Vivian's eyes moved past Callan and landed on the child standing halfway down the hall. "There you are, sweetheart," she said smoothly. "You gave everyone quite a scare." Maisie immediately stepped backward. Ash growled. Tessa moved closer, her posture shifting subtly into something more official. "Ms. Crowe," she said, extending her hand. "Tessa Vale Child Protective Services. Before any transfer happens today, I'll need to review your documentation." Vivian handed over the folder without hesitation. "Of course," she replied calmly. "Everything is perfectly in order." Callan watched Maisie instead of the paperwork. Her shoulders had curled inward. Her fingers were shaking. This was not the nervousness of a child who had misbehaved. This was fear. Real fear. And suddenly Callan understood with absolute certainty that the storm from the night before had never truly ended. It had simply followed them inside. The foyer grew very quiet. Vivian Crowe stood calmly just inside the doorway, snowlight behind her, looking as composed as if she had arrived for a polite afternoon meeting, rather than to retrieve a terrified child. Her posture was perfect, her voice warm, the kind of warmth that had probably fooled a lot of people before today. Maisie did not look fooled. She had retreated farther into the hallway, now nearly hidden again behind the corner wall. Ash remained between her and the foyer, his low growl vibrating deep in his chest. Vivian noticed. Her smile didn't fade, but something in her eyes hardened. "Maisie," she said gently, "you mustn't frighten people like this. Running away in a snowstorm is very dangerous." Maisie shook her head slowly. "I didn't run away." Vivian tilted her head, the smile tightening just slightly. "Of course you did, sweetheart." Callan stepped forward before Maisie could answer. "She didn't run away," he said evenly. "She escaped." The word hung in the air. Vivian turned her attention to him now. the smile returning like a mask slipping back into place. Mr. Voss, I understand emotions are high, but Maisie has a history of dramatizing situations. Children from unstable homes often do. Behind him, Maisie whispered, "That's what she always says." Tessa opened the folder Vivian had handed her and began reviewing the documents carefully. Page after page turned in slow, deliberate silence. Vivian watched her with the calm confidence of someone used to paperwork protecting her. But after a moment, Tessa's brow shifted, just slightly. "Interesting," she murmured. Vivian's smile sharpened. "Is there a problem?" Tessa held up one page. "This document is missing the county authorization seal." Vivian's expression didn't change. "That must be an administrative oversight." Tessa turned another page. "And the case number format here is outdated. It references a filing system that was replaced 2 years ago." For the first time, Vivian blinked. Only once. But Callan saw it, the smallest crack in the performance. From the hallway, Maisie's voice came out barely louder than breath. "She smiles like that when people are watching." The words landed like a stone dropped in still water. Vivian's eyes flicked toward the child, and for just 1 second, the smile disappeared completely. What remained in its place was cold. For a moment, no one in the room spoke. The silence stretched tight between them, broken only by the quiet crackle of the fireplace and the soft shifting of Ash's paws on the hardwood floor. Vivian Crow stood very still near the front door, the leather folder now closed in Tessa's hands. The polite warmth had not returned to her face. Instead, she watched the room with a calculating stillness that felt far colder than the snow outside. Tessa flipped through another page. "Miss Crow," she said calmly. "This guardianship order references a hearing that does not appear in the county database." Vivian folded her gloved hands together. "As I said, administrative issues happen." Callan leaned slightly against the hallway wall, his arms crossed, but his eyes remained on Maisie. The child had not moved. Her shoulders were drawn inward, her fingers buried deep in Ash's fur. Her eyes locked on Vivian the way prey watches a predator that has not yet decided whether to strike. "That's her," Maisie whispered again. Vivian heard it. Her gaze shifted slowly to the child. "You've been telling stories again," she said softly. Maisie flinched. Callan straightened immediately. "She's not telling stories." Vivian looked back at him, her composure tightening. "Mr. Voss," she replied smoothly, "children with trauma often reinterpret discipline as cruelty. It's unfortunate, but common." Before he could respond, another voice came from the kitchen. "That's not trauma reinterpretation." Dr. Mara Ellison stepped into the foyer, having arrived quietly through the back entrance. She carried her medical bag in one hand, her expression calm but unmistakably sharp. "That's fear," she continued. Vivian turned toward her. "And you are the physician who examined the child you claim was safe." Mara met her gaze without blinking. "Bruises in multiple healing stages," she said. "Malnutrition indicators, severe hypervigilance. Those aren't symptoms of a child who simply misbehaved." Vivian's jaw tightened. "You're making accusations." "No," Mara replied evenly. "I'm describing evidence." Tessa closed the folder slowly. "Ms. Crow," she said, "until these documents are verified, Maisie will remain here under temporary protective hold." Vivian's calm finally fractured. "You can't do that without cause." Tessa looked directly at her. "The cause," she said quietly, "is an 8-year-old child who chose a blizzard over staying with you." The words hit the room like thunder. And for the first time since she arrived, Vivian Crow looked uncertain. Vivian Crow did not explode. People like her rarely did. Instead, the uncertainty that had flickered across her face vanished almost as quickly as it had appeared. Her shoulders straightened, her expression smoothing back into that practiced calm that had probably convinced dozens of officials, inspectors, and donors that she was exactly what she claimed to be: a patient caretaker, a respectable professional, a woman trying her best. "Well," she said lightly, adjusting one of her gloves, "this is clearly a misunderstanding that has gotten out of proportion." Her voice had regained its warmth, but now it carried a sharp undertone of irritation. "Maisie." She continued, looking toward the hallway again. "You know you're not allowed to frighten people with stories like this." Maisie shrank back farther behind the wall. Ash's growl deepened. Callan stepped forward without thinking, placing himself fully between Vivian and the child. "You can stop talking to her like that," he said quietly. Vivian's smile thinned. "Mr. Voss, you found her on your property. That doesn't make you responsible for her." "It does when she was freezing beside my trash gate." The words hung in the air like something heavy and unavoidable. For a moment, Vivian didn't answer. Instead, she turned her attention back to Tessa. "I assume you understand the legal consequences of withholding a child from her authorized guardian," she said coolly. Tessa didn't flinch. "I understand the legal consequences of returning a child to an unsafe environment," she replied. Vivian let out a quiet breath of disbelief. "This is absurd. My facility is licensed, inspected, approved by the county." "Your paperwork has already shown irregularities," Tessa said calmly. "And children with behavioral issues often invent accusations," Vivian shot back quickly. That was the moment the mask slipped again. Not dramatically, but enough. Her voice had hardened. The sweetness had drained out of it, replaced by something colder and far more revealing. From the hallway, Maisie whispered again. "That's what she says before she gets mad." The sentence landed like a blade. Vivian's head turned slowly toward the girl. Her eyes were no longer warm, they were sharp, calculating. For 1 second, the entire house held its breath. Then Vivian laughed softly, though the sound carried no humor. "You think you're saving her?" she said, her gaze moving from Maisie to Callan. "You have no idea what she's actually like." Callan felt anger rise hot in his chest, but he forced his voice to stay steady. "You're done speaking about her." The authority in his tone was unmistakable. Vivian looked at him carefully, now reassessing the situation with new precision. Then she took a slow step toward the door. "Very well," she said calmly. "If you prefer to complicate this situation legally, we can do that." As she passed the hallway, she leaned just slightly toward Maisie, her voice dropping low enough that only the child could hear it. "You can't hide here forever." Maisie recoiled like she had been struck. Callan moved instantly, stepping between them again. "You will not speak to her again without supervision," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. Vivian straightened, her expression once again polished and composed, but the threat had already been delivered. She opened the front door herself and stepped out into the bright snow heels clicking sharply against the stone porch. A car door slammed outside. The engine started, and when the vehicle finally disappeared down the white driveway, the house fell silent again. Behind him, Maisie's knees gave out. She slid slowly to the floor, and for the first time since the night before, the storm inside the house truly began. For several seconds after the car disappeared down the long, snow-covered driveway, no one in the house moved. The silence felt heavy, like the moment after thunder when the air is still deciding whether the storm is truly over. Then Maisie's legs gave out. She slid down the hallway wall until she was sitting on the floor, her small shoulders shaking beneath the oversized shirt she wore. Ash immediately pressed against her side, his warm weight steady and protective, as if he understood that the danger had only just passed. Callan crossed the room quickly, but stopped himself before touching her. "Maisie," he said gently. Her breathing was uneven. "She's gone," he added softly. "She's not coming back inside." Maisie didn't answer. She kept staring at the front door, like she expected it to burst open again at any second. "They always come back," she whispered. The certainty in her voice carried years of experience. Tessa stepped forward, slowly kneeling a few feet away from the girl so she wouldn't feel cornered. "Not today," she said calmly. Maisie looked up at her, uncertain. "Are you sure Tessa didn't give the kind of false reassurance children often heard from adults trying to end a difficult conversation?" Instead, she answered honestly, "I'm sure that right now you're safe here." That seemed to mean more. Maisie's shoulders loosened slightly, though the tension didn't fully leave her body. From the kitchen doorway, Mara watched quietly, arms folded. She had seen this before in hospital rooms, the fragile moment when someone realizes the immediate danger has passed, but the fear hasn't yet caught up with the new reality. Callan finally knelt beside the girl. "Look at me," he said softly. Maisie hesitated before raising her eyes. "She's not in this house anymore," he told her. Her fingers tightened in Ash's fur. "And if she comes back?" she asked. Callan didn't hesitate this time. "Then she deals with me." Maisie studied his face carefully, the way children do when they're trying to measure the difference between confidence and truth. After a long moment, she nodded once. It wasn't complete trust, but it was the beginning of it. Tessa rose to her feet and turned toward Callan. "I'll need to file a protective hold immediately," she said. "That will prevent Ms. Crow from legally removing Maisie until the documentation is verified." Callan nodded. "Do it." Tessa paused before leaving her gaze drifting briefly toward the little girl sitting on the floor. "Children don't run into storms for attention," she said quietly. "They run because wherever they came from felt worse." Callan didn't respond right away. He simply looked at Maisie again, the bruises along her arms, the smudged phone number still written across her small hand, the way she kept glancing toward the door like a shadow might appear there again. For years, he had believed his house was a fortress, a place built to keep chaos out. But now he understood something with uncomfortable clarity. The storm hadn't entered this house. The truth had. And once you saw something like that, once you heard a child whisper that she would rather face the cold than go back, you didn't get to pretend you hadn't seen it. Callan Voss looked down at the frightened girl sitting on his hallway floor and felt the weight of a decision settle firmly in his chest. This was no longer just about helping a child. This was about what kind of man he was willing to be when the storm came to his door. By late afternoon, the house no longer felt like a quiet refuge. It felt like the center of something larger that had only just begun to unfold. Callan stood in his home office, the same room where he had negotiated acquisitions worth hundreds of millions of dollars, without once raising his voice. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the frozen slope behind the house, the snow reflecting pale light into the room. His desk was immaculate. His calendar was not. On the screen in front of him sat a stack of legal documents Avery had just emailed. Emergency Protective Guardianship Petition. If he filed it, the situation would become official, public, complicated, and expensive. His phone buzzed. The board chair. Callan answered. "We're waiting for you," the man said sharply. "The acquisition vote can't be delayed again." Callan glanced through the glass wall of his office toward the living room. Maisie sat on the rug beside the couch, building a small tower out of wooden blocks she had found in a decorative basket. Ash lay next to her, occasionally nudging the blocks with his nose and earning quiet laughter in return. The house had never sounded like that before. "I'm not coming," Callan said. A pause followed. "You're joking." "No." "Callan, this deal affects 300 employees, I'm aware. And your absence will be interpreted." Callan looked at the child sitting on the floor of his living room, the girl who had nearly died outside his gate the night before. "Then let it be interpreted," he said calmly. He ended the call. The silence in the office felt heavier afterward. Avery arrived an hour later carrying a leather folder and the kind of serious expression that meant she had already considered every possible consequence. "If you file this," she said, "without sitting down, you invite scrutiny. Media attention if the Crow investigation expands. Home evaluations. Background checks. Good, Callan replied. Avery studied him carefully. You understand what you're doing. You run a company, Callan. Investors don't like unpredictability. He turned his head slightly, looking again toward the living room. Maisie had finished her small tower. Now she was carefully adding another block to the top, concentrating as if the entire structure depended on perfect balance. Unpredictability isn't the problem, he said quietly. Avery raised an eyebrow. Neglect is. The room went silent. Callan picked up the pen lying on the desk. He read the top page one more time. Then he signed. The ink sank into the paper in one clean line. Across the house, Maisie suddenly laughed when Ash knocked over the tower she had built. The sound reached him through the quiet rooms. And for the first time since he had found her in the snow, Callan felt something strange settle inside his chest. Not anger, not guilt. Something steadier. Purpose. That evening, the house had finally grown quiet again. Snow drifted gently outside the windows, far calmer than the violent storm from the night before. The world looked peaceful again, too peaceful, as if the mountains had already forgotten how close a child had come to dying in the cold. Inside, Maisie had fallen asleep on the couch. One small hand still rested in Ash's thick fur, her fingers curled into it like an anchor. The oversized blanket Callan had given her was half tangled around her shoulders, rising and falling slowly with each exhausted breath. Callan stood in the kitchen reading through the guardianship documents Avery had left behind. He had just finished reviewing the last page when his phone buzzed again. This time the caller ID read Dr. Mara Ellison. He answered immediately. Mara. I just got confirmation from the hospital, she said. Callan straightened slightly. About Maisie's mother, yes. He waited. Elena Wren is alive. The words hit him harder than he expected. Alive, he repeated. She was admitted 3 weeks ago after a domestic assault, Mara explained. Multiple injuries. Broken ribs, concussion, internal bleeding. She's been in the trauma ward since then. Callan glanced toward the living room where Maisie slept. They told the daughter she was gone, he said quietly. That wouldn't surprise me, Mara replied. If Vivian Crow took control of the placement paperwork while the mother was hospitalized, it would have been easy to isolate the child. Callan's jaw tightened. Can Elena talk? He asked. Not tonight, Mara said. But she's conscious now. Stable. They expect she'll be able to speak with someone tomorrow. Callan nodded slowly, though Mara couldn't see him. Does she know where her daughter is? No, Mara said softly. The silence stretched between them. After a moment, Mara added, Callan, when she finds out, it's going to mean everything that someone believed her child. Callan ended the call and remained standing in the kitchen for a long moment. Then he walked into the living room. Maisie shifted slightly in her sleep as he approached, murmuring something soft and unclear. Ash lifted his head briefly before settling again when he recognized him. Callan crouched beside the couch. He studied the smudged ink on the child's hand again, the phone number Elena had written in desperate hope that someone kind might eventually see it. And someone had, but only by accident. If Ash hadn't barked, if Callan had ignored the dog, if the storm had buried the tracks before he walked outside. The thought made his stomach tighten. Maisie stirred again, her eyes fluttering open just enough to see him. Her voice was thick with sleep. Did she find me? Callan understood who she meant. He shook his head gently. No. Maisie blinked slowly. Okay, she whispered. Her eyes closed again within seconds. Callan stayed there for a while, watching the steady rise and fall of her breathing. Tomorrow her mother would learn the truth. Tomorrow the system that had nearly swallowed her would begin answering questions. Tomorrow everything would become more complicated. But tonight the child who had run into a blizzard was sleeping safely on his couch. And that for the moment was enough. The house had never sounded like this before. For years, Callan Voss had lived in a silence so complete, it had almost become another piece of furniture, something polished, predictable, carefully maintained. Even the music he sometimes played in the evenings had been chosen for its ability to fill space without disturbing it. Tonight was different. Ash's soft breathing filled the living room. The fire crackled gently in the stone fireplace, and on the couch, Maisie slept. Callan sat in the armchair across from her, one elbow resting on his knee as he watched the small rise and fall of her shoulders beneath the blanket. The smudged ink on her hand was still faintly visible even in the dim firelight. Elena Wren's phone number. A desperate message written by a mother who had hoped that somehow, somewhere, someone might help her daughter. Someone had. But the thought of how easily it could have ended differently still unsettled him. Callan leaned back in the chair, letting his gaze drift toward the tall windows. Outside, the mountains were quiet under a blanket of fresh snow. The storm had left the world clean and silent. Inside his chest, however, something restless remained. He had built this house after his sister died, a fortress of glass, steel, and security systems. Gates, cameras, motion sensors, layers of control designed to prevent chaos from entering his life again. But the truth had slipped through anyway. Not with violence, with a whisper. "Please. I don't want to die outside." Callan closed his eyes briefly. Across the room, Maisie shifted in her sleep. At first it seemed small, just a slight tightening of her shoulders beneath the blanket. But then her breathing changed, quick and uneven. Her fingers tightened in Ash's fur. "No. Please," she murmured. The fear in the words made Callan stand instantly. He moved slowly toward the couch, careful not to startle her. Ash lifted his head as well, watching her face with quiet concern. Maisie's brow twisted, as if she were still trapped somewhere far away from the warm room around her. "They said, 'Be quiet,'" she whispered. Callan knelt beside the couch. "Maisie," he said gently. Her eyes opened suddenly. For a second she didn't recognize where she was. Panic flashed across her face as she pushed herself halfway upright, breathing fast. Then she saw him. The room. The fire. Ash. The fear drained slowly from her expression. "You're still here," she whispered. Callan nodded. "Yes." Maisie studied his face for a moment, as if verifying the answer. Then almost shyly she asked the question she had asked before. "You won't send me back?" Callan didn't hesitate. "No." This time the word carried something stronger than reassurance. It carried decision. Maisie relaxed slightly against the cushions, the tension leaving her small shoulders for the first time since she had arrived. Within minutes, she had fallen asleep again. Callan remained kneeling beside the couch a while longer, staring into the quiet fire. The storm had ended outside, but he knew something with absolute certainty now. The real fight had only just begun. Morning sunlight spilled through the tall windows, turning the snow outside into a field of white fire. Callan stood in the kitchen with a cup of coffee he had already forgotten to drink. The house was quiet except for the soft clatter of dishes and the faint sound of Ash's tail thumping against the floor. Maisie sat at the dining table. She wore one of Callan's spare sweaters again, the sleeves still too long for her hands. In front of her sat a plate of scrambled eggs and toast. She ate slowly, carefully, the way children sometimes do when they're not sure if food is something they're allowed to have. Callan noticed she kept glancing toward the front door. "Someone coming?" she asked quietly. "Not today," he said. She nodded, but the tension didn't leave her shoulders. Callan pulled out a chair across from her and sat down. "There's something I need to tell you," he said gently. Maisie looked up. "About your mom." Her fork stopped in midair. Callan chose his words carefully. "She's alive." The reaction was immediate. Maisie stood up so quickly the chair tipped slightly behind her. "She is." Her voice trembled between hope and disbelief. She's in the hospital, Callan continued softly. She was hurt, but she's recovering. Maisie's eyes filled with tears. She tried very hard not to let fall. They told me she didn't want me anymore, she whispered. Callan leaned forward slightly. That wasn't true. Maisie stared at him. For a moment, she looked like she might break apart under the weight of the news. Then she asked the only question that mattered. Does she know I'm alive? Callan shook his head slowly. Not yet. Maisie sat back down, slowly absorbing the words. Outside, the snow sparkled peacefully under the sun. But inside the house, a new storm was beginning to form, one made not of wind and ice, but of truth. Late that morning, another car pulled slowly into the driveway. Maisie saw it first. She had been sitting on the living room rug with Ash quietly stacking the same wooden blocks she had played with the day before. The moment the engine sound reached the house, her hands froze in midair. They're here, she whispered. Callan looked through the window. A familiar figure stepped out of the car. Tessa Vale. Maisie released a small breath she hadn't realized she was holding. When Callan opened the door, Tessa stepped inside carrying a thin folder and a tired but reassuring smile. Good morning, she said. Good morning, Callan replied. Any news? Tessa nodded once. Quite a bit. She glanced toward the living room where Maisie now stood beside Ash, watching cautiously, but not hiding this time. That's a good sign, Tessa said quietly. What is she didn't run? Callan hadn't noticed it until she pointed it out. Yesterday, Maisie had disappeared the moment a car pulled into the driveway. Today, she stayed where she was. It was a small change, but small changes mattered. Tessa crouched down slightly, so she was level with the girl. Hi again, Maisie. Maisie gave a tiny wave. Tessa opened the folder in her hands. The investigation into Vivian Crowe has already started, she said, looking back toward Callan. There are problems with her documentation. Serious ones. Callan's expression hardened. What kind of problems? Financial records that don't match placement reports, Tessa said. Guardianship orders that may never have been approved by a judge. Maisie listened quietly from across the room. Ash sat pressed against her leg like a living shield. Tessa continued. If those records are confirmed to be fraudulent, Ms. Crowe could lose custody of every child under her care. Callan glanced at Maisie again. For the first time since the night before, something new appeared in the girl's expression. Hope. Small. Careful. But real. The afternoon passed more peacefully than any moment since the storm. Snow continued falling softly outside, drifting through the tall pine trees that surrounded the property. The world beyond the windows looked calm again, almost gentle, as if the mountains themselves had decided to rest. Inside the house, the atmosphere had changed too. Maisie sat on the living room rug with a piece of paper and a box of crayons Mara had brought earlier that day. Ash lay beside her, occasionally lifting his head to inspect the drawing before resting it again with a satisfied sigh. Callan watched from the kitchen. For a long time, Maisie didn't say anything. She concentrated on the paper with serious focus, the same careful determination she had shown while stacking the wooden blocks earlier. Eventually, she stood and walked over to him. I made something, she said quietly. Callan crouched down so he could see. The drawing showed a house beneath falling snow. 4 stick figures stood in front of it. One tall, one with long hair, one small, and one very large golden dog. Callan pointed to the tall figure. That's me, Maisie nodded. And this one, he asked, pointing to the woman with long hair. My mom. Her voice softened slightly. And this one, he asked, pointing to the smallest figure. That's me. Callan noticed something else. The small figure was standing in the middle of the others, not off to the side. Protected. Included. Is this your house? He asked. Maisie looked around the living room slowly before answering. I think so, she said. Callan felt something tighten quietly in his chest. Maisie studied his face for a moment, then asked the question that mattered most. Do I get to stay here until my mom comes back? Callan didn't hesitate. Yes. Maisie nodded as if that answer had settled something deep inside her. Then she handed him the drawing. Okay, she said simply. And for the first time since the storm, the house truly felt warm. That night the snow returned. Not the violent storm from before, just a soft, quiet snowfall drifting down across the mountains of Blackridge. Inside the house the fire burned low and steady. Maisie had fallen asleep on the couch again, one hand buried deep in Ash's fur. The crayon drawing she had made earlier rested on the coffee table nearby. Callan stood near the window looking out across the yard. The rear service gate was barely visible through the falling snow. The place where he had found her. He could still see it clearly in his mind, the small shape in the cold, the trembling voice carried through the wind. Please, I don't want to die outside. For years, Callan had built his life around control. Locked gates, security systems, schedules designed to keep chaos away. But chaos had arrived anyway. Only it hadn't destroyed his life. It had changed it. Behind him, Maisie stirred slightly in her sleep. You're still here? She murmured. Callan turned and looked at the small figure resting safely beneath the blanket. Yes, he said softly. And for the first time in a very long time, the house no longer felt like a fortress. It felt like a home. Did this story touch your heart? Let us know how you felt. Rate it from 1 to 10 in the comments below. If it moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to support the channel. Don't forget to tap the bell so you never miss our next heartfelt story. Click the end screen to watch more emotional journeys. See you in the next one.